There we go. Sorry about that. Totally forgot to do that. So again, everyone, welcome to the Education Spring Series. This workshop series is sponsored by MnDOT's Office of Aeronautics and administered by the Airport Technical Assistance Program, also known as AirTAP. We are located at the Center for Transportation Studies at the University of Minnesota. So just to give you a little information about what or who is AirTAP. So AirTAP began in 2000. It was the first of its kind in the nation, offering practical yet specialized training and resources across the state for those who operate, maintain, and administer Minnesota's public use airports. Minnesota's general aviation personnel across the state have had access to targeted information and training to reduce costs and improve the quality, safety, and the overall efficiency of airport operations. AirTAP also helps airport staff build a community network for exchanging best practices and learning from one another. So AirTAP, we have 4 major service areas. One is education and training. So besides the spring series, we do an annual fall Airports 101 for those who are newer to the airport community. We also help arrange a spring conference every year in April. We provide technical assistance, access to experts, and we have a lot of resources and printed materials. Everything would be located on our website. So again, welcome to our education series. This is one of eight workshops we're putting on. Some we've already presented in March and April, and they have been recorded and available on our website, but we have 3 more coming up over the next several weeks that you guys can check out. And again, if you want to hear some of the recordings, please don't hesitate to check out our website at airtap.umn.edu. And if you are new to Zoom meeting platform, along the bottom, you have a black ribbon where you have mute all the way on the left-hand side. So we're going to stay muted. At the end, we'll be answering any questions, and you can unmute yourself to talk directly with our presenters. The stop video, you can show your video, you can not show or turn it off. It's completely up to you. There's a participant icon, and that you can see who's attending. The chat box, this is where we'll want you to insert your questions. And I will also be uploading the presentation materials to the chat box. And then also screen sharing, it is live for everyone, but you won't have to use it. Again, this training is being recorded and will become available on our website later today, early tomorrow. And feel free to use reactions. There's thumbs up, there's high fives, there's a variety of things that you can do to show a visual reaction to the presentations today. And again, welcome everyone. I am Catherine Stanley. I am the AirTAP program coordinator, and I want to welcome you to today's presentation. And right now I'm going to hand it over to Brian Page, who is today's moderator.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning, and thank you, Catherine. To just kind of set the table a little bit, I guess I am Brian Page. I am the manager of our aviation engineering group based here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We are a top 25 engineering firm doing work here in Minnesota and across the country. So where my role fit in, I guess, in this presentation is I'm a part of the conference planning committee to help kind of organize and put together the various different sessions being presented through AirTAP and then also through the Minnesota Council of Airports conference as well. So we've got a couple of great speakers lined up for you today. We've got a couple of guests, first of which is Yolanda Wolf, and talk a little bit about her, but we also have Katie Gilmour with MnDOT, and both are very experienced and have a lot of information to share regarding urban air mobility. And to kind of introduce, I guess, Yolanda Wolf. Yolanda is the executive director of the Community Air Mobility Initiative, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to support the responsible integration of the third dimension of transportation into communities through education, communication, and collaboration. Prior to joining CAMI, She was a sustainable aviation consultant for 10 years, working with industry, government, academia, and nonprofits on policies, standards, and regulations, industry development, market challenges, communications, and media relations. Jolanta is a business attorney and consultant with over 2 decades of experience in the successful development, implementation, and management of mission-driven programs. She has experience in sustainable transportation and land use. Jolanta also organizes and convenes the annual CAFE Foundation's Electric Aircraft Symposium annually. And I introduce our second speaker, which is Katie Gilmour, as a manned and unmanned aircraft pilot. Katie Gilmour has focused on aviation and technology for more than 20 years. After spending time as a military officer and then in technology and defense industries, Katie began working with commercial drones in 2015. Katie now works for MnDOT, Office of Aeronautics, focusing on unmanned flight operations, technology application and policies, and planning for advanced air technologies. So both of our guests are very knowledgeable and experienced, and we'd encourage you, as Catherine mentioned in the beginning, to ask a lot of great questions. We'd just ask to kind of keep the presentation flowing, to kind of keep those questions to the end, if at all possible. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our guest speaker, Jolanta, and have her get started on the presentation.
Well, thank you, Brian. And hello, everybody. I'm actually coming to you from the Seattle area where I live. And it's a pleasure to be able to speak to you this morning. I'm going to share my screen if you'll just give me a moment. And could you let me know, are you seeing my presentation now?
Yes, we are.
Perfect. All right. One more moment to rearrange all the screens. There we go. So as Brian said, today we're talking to you about advanced air mobility, adding the third dimension to urban and regional transportation. And hopefully between Katie and I will give you a bit of a national and state perspective. Sorry, appear to be having technical difficulties. There we go. And as Brian mentioned, I am the executive director of CAMI, the Community Air Mobility Initiative, and our mission is to support the responsible integration of the third dimension into our daily transportation needs. So we were created 2 years ago now. My co-founder is Anna Dietrich, and we were created to broaden the conversation and support local communities with advanced air mobility integration. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. We educate and equip state and local decision makers, planners, industry members, and the public with the information they need to set policies and design infrastructure and systems that address transportation needs for their communities. We also bring the concerns of the communities back to the advanced air mobility industry to help that industry chart the right course for success. We're a virtual organization operating globally. So we're in the third revolution of flight. The first, of course, was powered flight, ushered in by the Wright brothers, and the second was the development of the jet engine. Now, technology drivers such as the electrification of propulsion, autonomy, and mobility as a service are once again redefining flight. This allows us to lower costs and barriers to the use of small aircraft on shorter routes, and increases the latent demand for flight as a viable alternative to ground transportation. There are a number of fixed-wing electric aircraft in development and flying today. The vastly lower operating costs of these aircraft can open up new markets, yet can largely be implemented within today's infrastructure, airspace, and operating environment. So the middle photo that you see here on this slide is the E-Flyer by Aerospace in Denver. This is an all-electric clean sheet design in its final critical design phase completion and doing flight tests. The company has orders for over 700 aircraft. You can also see Ampaire's hybrid Cessna 337 up in the top photo. In this photo, it's flying over Los Angeles. a couple of years ago, Ampere has been doing flight demonstrations with Mokulele Airlines in Hawaii, and it's now preparing to do additional tests in the UK. And then down at the bottom, late in 2019, Harbour Air in Vancouver, British Columbia flew an electric de Havilland Beaver with Seattle-based MagniX's 750 horsepower motor. And last summer, MagniX flew an all-electric Cessna Caravan for 30 minutes. That's the photo that you see here. There's been tremendous activity in the world of eVTOL, electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. Electric motors provide vertical takeoff capabilities, but very limited hover. Wing-borne crews and rotor-borne designs serve different mission profiles. There are over 300 concepts published to date. A handful are mature and in testing programs with over 1,000 hours of test flights under their belts. Autonomy technology is moving forward as well. While most eVTOLs are beginning as piloted vehicles and then moving towards autonomy, some companies such as California-based Wisk are designing autonomy into their aircraft from the beginning. Because human error accounts for more than 75% of all accidents in personal and on-demand general aviation flights, autonomy has risen to the top as an enabling technology because it can increase safety and lower costs. But it remains to be seen how well it will be accepted by the traveling public. So what is advanced air mobility? So it's one of the most commonly used terms for this new form of flight enabled by these new technologies. The development of new aircraft allows us to look at new use cases and to improve existing use cases. Urban air mobility, or UAM, which you might have heard, is often used interchangeably with AAM. We tend to use urban air mobility to focus on those shorter distance urban use cases, and we use the term regional air mobility, or RAM, for the longer distances, but both are subsets of advanced air mobility. While the terminology is still developing, what is clear is that there are multiple zones of operation for advanced air mobility. So these include connections within urban centers and also connecting urban economic centers to hub airports, suburbs, edge cities, and rural areas. And these operations can exist in multiple forms, including a micro-haul airline with scheduled service, bus route style air metro service, on-demand service, airport shuttles, and perhaps most importantly for early adoption, emergency services and goods delivery. It's important to remember that while small drones, often referred to as SUAS, will share airspace with some of the advanced air mobility aircraft, there are significant differences between the two industries. Small drones have been allowed to fly without design certification, provided they don't put people on the ground at risk. Advanced air mobility, like traditional aircraft, are certified against stringent safety criteria by the FAA. So the aviation industry will develop, build, and deliver an air taxi or advanced air mobility aircraft faster than most cities can build a highway. Morgan Stanley projects that urban air mobility will be the single largest new industry to emerge this generation. And this is encouraging for industry and for the supporting workforce. Automotive OEMs are investing in advanced air mobility research. This perspective is important because the anticipated volume of vehicles in the manufacturing and operating arenas will be much more akin to automotive than traditional aviation. But it's important to remember that this new industry has to date been a technology push. Those technologies that I mentioned in the first slide have helped create opportunities. However, we don't yet have an expressed market need for this new form of transportation, though it's starting to develop. But to develop and implement advanced air mobility means that we need to understand that market demand. The upper photo is a view of aviation that most people are familiar with today. There's a strict boundary between your daily life and your flight. And while we have to maintain security and safety in advanced air mobility operations, to be successful, we have to at least figuratively tear down the fence. Advanced air mobility needs to be intimately integrated with existing transportation systems, including highways and transit options. And we need to do that integration in a way that doesn't create a whole host of new problems. Doing that integration correctly is really a local question. To date, most of the industry-level regulatory and policy discussions have been happening at the federal level. We need to be working towards a constructive and consistent local regulatory landscape as well. And that means engaging all of the stakeholders. So who are those stakeholders? Well, you see a lot of them here. So they range from industry members, such as manufacturers and operators and airports, to regulators at the federal, state, and local levels, agencies such as transportation and commerce, business owners, essential services, and the public. At CAMI, our mission is to bridge these stakeholders and provide opportunities for education, communication, and collaboration. One of the critical pieces to developing market demand is achieving public acceptance of advanced air mobility as a transportation option. And that requires us to address 4 factors: trust, public benefit, adverse impacts, and integration. Safety is critical and non-negotiable. Commercial aircraft has a strong safety record. However, advanced air mobility will scale to a level more akin to automobiles, as I mentioned, and it isn't easy to determine what is safe enough. While it's primarily up to the regulators, like the FAA, to answer that question, we also have to consider the public perception of safety, which comes from trust, and earning that trust is key. It's also essential to public acceptance that we're able to demonstrate public benefits early on. One of the first questions we often get is whether urban air vehicles are just limos for the very rich. The answer is no, it has to be no. Advanced air mobility uses the 3rd dimension to provide commercial, economically viable transportation for the public. So these benefits include increased transportation options, socioeconomic benefits, workforce development, and of course, emergency services. Advanced air mobility has great potential to bring a broad availability at a reasonable price to the public and a new mode of travel to metropolitan transportation systems. However, all of these benefits are in effect mitigating factors against the inevitable negative impacts that advanced air mobility will bring. To achieve public acceptance, we need to limit the adverse impacts of advanced air mobility. And that begins with transparency about the impacts, which include noise, visual pollution, emissions, battery life cycle challenges, impact on the grid, and impact on existing modes of public transportation. To enable the maximum benefit from advanced air mobility, it needs to be integrated with the existing transportation landscape within a community. Vertiports need to be strategically located to integrate with transportation hubs such as light rail stations and airports. Advanced air mobility has to take accessibility and equity considerations into account. AAM also needs to integrate in a constructive way with existing transit. And finally, it needs to integrate with and augment existing goods delivery modes. And all of this planning needs to happen in the larger context of understanding that an advanced air mobility flight is part of a complete and integrated trip from the perspective of the traveler. Community decision makers have a complex balancing act. Almost all residents will be impacted by advanced air mobility, some directly, some indirectly, some positively, some negatively. And cities and states do not want to replicate the inequities of the 1950s with the rollout of the federal highway system. So this needs to be done thoughtfully and planned for. The starting point for considering these opportunities in the larger context of metropolitan transportation systems is a systems master planning approach. This is a comprehensive process which includes internal assessment, community engagement, resources and data collection, and development of an implementation plan. So what kind of considerations go into this plan? Integration into multimodal transportation systems, incorporating local priorities and policies, addressing sustainability in the environment, economy, and equity, working on business models and forecasting so to understand the best routes and locations for such a system, infrastructure mapping, what do you already have, what are you missing, airspace management and route design, grid capacity and power strategies, very important for adding these vehicles into the system, and of course, funding and timelines. And when we look at the infrastructure components of such a systems master plan, we see that they help to define the system as well as being a product of that system. They include hardscape, but also much more. So we need to look at existing and future ground transportation system plans. Where does it make sense to be locating vertiports in conjunction with these future systems? We need to look at built structures, both existing and new. Again, energy generation, transmission, charging, and storage. We want to consider weather, communications, airspace management, and data-driven route planning. So looking more closely at infrastructure considerations, we see that these considerations include both new and repurposed infrastructure, consideration of aircraft types, and integration into the ground transportation systems. So here are some of the considerations when it comes to infrastructure planning. For existing transportation, we need to ensure that the rest of the system is able to accommodate this new form of transportation so that it's truly a multimodal system. So we need to look at things like first and last mile connections, and how do high volume vertiports impact the public transportation networks that they will intersect with. For land use and zoning, existing or proposed zoning may preclude the development of vertiports. So we need to work with local planners and decision makers to proactively address these issues so we don't run into public acceptance roadblocks. With built infrastructure, we need to think of current and future volumes. And for energy, we need to do analyses and scenario development to ensure that we have sufficient infrastructure to support planned commercial operations. When we look at the built environment that we're working with, it's important to recognize that one size does not fit all. Communities are unique with different demographics, economies, geographies, resources, and existing transportation systems. And individual communities are often part of a larger metropolitan planning region with its own unique transportation infrastructure, patterns, and needs. So an infrastructure system may need to work with different requirements of an urban core, suburban residential areas, edge cities, and out to rural areas. While much of the publicity in the industry is focused on urban core vertiports, these are most likely the furthest out in terms of implementation. However, we have an opportunity to use existing infrastructure to jumpstart this new form of transportation by revitalizing existing public airports. These smaller airports are largely underused or unused. However, they have the ability to provide an important resource to their communities by entering the electric aviation industry. Not only can smaller airports accommodate both electric fixed-wing and eVTOL aircraft, they can also serve as collectors and storers of electricity, providing charging for aircraft and ground vehicles, and extra grid capacity for their community. They can provide maintenance and repair operations for electric aircraft. They can be air and ground transportation hubs for both passengers and cargo. And with low-cost electric aircraft, it becomes possible to reconnect smaller communities that became isolated due to the decline of the regional air carriers. So here are some considerations that we need to look at to get airports ready for electric aviation. So we need to look whether electric aircraft deployment should be incorporated into long-term airport planning efforts. We need to educate the airport users, the tenants, and community stakeholders about electric aviation, its benefits, and its impacts. We need to develop electric aircraft and electricity generation and storage infrastructure in coordination with the utility companies. We need to work with local planners as electric aircraft may need to be incorporated into local comprehensive and transportation strategic planning efforts. We need to work with local universities to promote sustainable technologies. And finally, we need to support workforce development for electric aircraft, including encouraging flight schools to integrate electric aircraft into their training and supporting connections with local industries for apprenticeships. But whether we're looking at rejuvenating existing airports or planning for new vertiports, it's important to look at these facilities as multimodal transportation hubs, offering a multitude of services. These services, again, need to be tailored to the location, the community needs, the existing transportation infrastructure, and the future plans for the region. This slide gives you an idea of what a mobility hub might look like. It'll typically have that core area that's served by public transit and by the electric aircraft and other forms of shared mobility. And just outside of that core are a variety of mobility options, both shared and active. And outside of that is what we call the catchment area, which is essentially the service area for that hub. And you can see that these mobility hubs can offer all kinds of services. Again, from charging both air and ground vehicles to amenities like dining and retail, and really become a part of their community. So infrastructure planning considerations are part of the larger advanced air mobility planning. The public and private sectors need to work together to understand how advanced air mobility will fit into a transportation ecosystem, how to identify and mitigate societal barriers and equity concerns, and how to ensure that advanced air mobility is included in all of the various long-range plans, policies, and budgets. These are, I've listed a number of other planning considerations here, which I won't read through, but these are questions of policy, of business modeling and forecasts, of multimodal transportation implementation, and of regulation. So pulling this all together, here's an overview of a systems master planning approach for advanced air mobility. We want to start with a system plan to incorporate electric aviation into the macro-regional fabric. We want to identify existing aviation assets for both vertical takeoff and landing and conventional takeoff and landing operations and assess their current contributions. We want to develop a thorough understanding of how electric aviation can enhance or hinder the movement of people and goods in the area of study. We need to assess large vertiport concepts versus smaller vertiport concepts and how they would affect road and transportation systems, and determine which airspace restrictions are applicable. We need to understand what automation does to the capacity of airports, or vertiports, excuse me, their natural limits. There's recharging time and passenger processing space. We can only fly so many aircraft through a vertiport at any one time. So we need to determine early opportunities to demonstrate public benefit. We need to consider workforce development opportunities, address equity issues up front, and address environmental issues through planning and mitigation. By following this type of approach, we can better ensure that we develop a strong market demand for advanced air mobility as one mode in a multimodal metropolitan transportation system. I like to use this slide because the industry at times tends to ride a hype cycle and make claims, very, very optimistic claims. And it's important to remember that to gain trust, we need to be transparent and realistic. We need to remember that sustainability and resiliency are important local policy goals, that communities are unique. One size does not fit all. We often, periodically hear claims that advanced air mobility will solve congestion. And that's not necessarily likely to be true. Advanced air mobility may pull some cars or some travelers off of the road, off of the highways, but we all know that induced demand just results in more cars filling those spaces. and we can't make an appreciable dent in congestion, except for possibly in certain locations. We also know that it may take a long time to achieve mass affordability. So how do we balance demonstrating public benefit early on versus the fact that early flights probably will be expensive? We need to recognize that environmental benefits include more than reduced emissions. We need to make sure we consider life cycle issues, and that a 15-minute flight doesn't solve a problem if the first and last mile issues aren't addressed. So in my last few minutes, I'm going to just give you a sense of what CAMI's doing to help address these issues. We have a number of programs. One of our main one is the Urban Air Policy Collaborative. The mission of this group is to develop a policy framework for the local implementation of advanced air mobility through the sharing of knowledge, discussion of issues, development of recommendations, and collaboration with peers through an ongoing program of workshops, presentations, and conversations. We have two programs within the Urban Air Policy Collaborative, the Cohort and the Forum. I'm going to tell you a little bit about both. So the Cohort is a 5-month deep dive program that's geared for state and local agencies and their staff. We ran our first cohort last fall, and we're currently in our second cohort. So you can see that the city of Minneapolis, as well as MnDOT, are part of our program, along with a number of other agencies and organizations around the country, or really around the continent. We have Vancouver, British Columbia as well. So in a minute, I'll share what that curriculum looks like, but we meet every other week for 2 hours to consider the issues around the implementation of advanced air mobility. And our sessions are a combination of presentations, of guest speakers, and of kind of roll up your sleeve workshops. The other part of our Urban Air Policy Collaborative program is the Forum. This is kicking off in a couple of weeks. And this will be a monthly 2-hour, again, working session that includes the members of the cohorts, the different agencies, but also our CAMI members. So representatives from industry, from other parts of the stakeholder spectrum. And this CAMI will facilitate these meetings. We'll pick topics that are issues that are important to the group. We'll bring in speakers or regulators, FAA or NASA or universities as needed. So this will be an opportunity to work together to find solutions. We're looking to develop model policies, best practices that the industry and that communities can share with each other. So I told you I'd share the collaborative, the cohort program, so you can see that we cover everything from advanced air mobility fundamentals to community environmental impacts, equity, integration into transportation and planning. So it's a pretty broad program. If you're with a jurisdictional agency and you're interested in this program, we'll have another one that begins probably towards the end of the summer. So just reach out to me or go to our website and let us know. We also do a fair amount of work with NASA. If any of you have followed NASA's work in advanced air mobility, you're familiar with their pentacopter, as they call it, the image in the bottom left, the 5 pillars that they're addressing. So we work in that top pillar in the purple, the community integration. They've just released a community annex. They're going to be working with, I think, 5 jurisdictions over the next year on implementation of advanced air mobility, and CAMI is doing the program development and implementation for that program. So we'll be doing workshops, a best practices document, community assessments, and some topical forums. We also work with their community integration working group on public acceptance, and with their science and technical working group on roles and responsibilities for different, the federal level, state level, local level, everything from flight to vertiport location and real-time management. I also want to let you know about our UAM 101. So we did this half-day workshop for planners and state and local decision makers a little over a year ago. We're going to be running it again on May 5th, an updated version, updated actually to now be called Advanced Air Mobility 101. That's how much the terms have changed in the last year. So this is, again, it's 4 hours. You can think of it as a very condensed version of that curriculum that you saw for the Urban Air Policy Collaborative cohort. And if you want to, the videos from last year are available for free on our website. The link is right there. We will, of course, be updating those materials. It's now a year later and a lot has happened. So if you're interested in that, you can go to our website. And I want to let you know about our online resources. These are available to anybody. We have a series of CAMI notes. These are short briefs on specific topics that give you a quick hit about about that topic. We also have our videos. As I mentioned, last year's UAM 101, we did a hour-and-a-half professional continuing education webinar for the American Planning Association. That's also available through our website. And we have a series of guidebooks coming out soon. These will be 20-page guidebooks on different topics. So those will be coming out this year. Our upcoming events. So our CAMI members, we meet quarterly in what we call an open house. That includes our members plus our expert contributors. We have a team of, I think, a dozen expert contributors that help us develop our materials. And this is, we usually have a guest conversation with a guest. It's not a formal presentation, but we'll pick a certain topic. We update everybody on CAMI's activities, and it's an opportunity for members and experts to network. Our first forum meeting will be April 27th, the UAM 101, and then, of course, our ongoing cohort meetings. And I would be remiss not to thank our members. So as you can see, we do have a broad range of stakeholders, from OEMs and suppliers to associations, consultants, tribal entities, airports, and several departments of transportation and cities that support our work. And with that, I will turn it over to Katie. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thanks, Yolanka. Always great to hear from CAMI. When I first started getting into AAM, they were one of the first resources that I found. I'm going to find my PowerPoint here and share with you. So they've had a lot of great information and a very valuable part of this community. So Brian did introductions a little earlier, so thanks, Brian. I am Katie Gilmour with MnDOT Office of Aeronautics. I have been in the drone world for a number of years and then started getting into advanced air, or UAM, AAM, earlier last year when we were first started attending the NASA working group meetings. As Yolanka mentioned, MnDOT and the city of Minneapolis are also involved in the UAPC with CAMI, talking about policy at the local level and across the nation. So lots of great resources there, and we're really happy to be involved in those. So today I'm going to talk about what this looks like from the state of Minnesota's perspective. The first slide I start with for a lot. So this is a group that probably knows this, but when I'm doing outreach in the public, the first question I get is, MnDOT Aeronautics, don't you guys fill potholes? And a lot of people don't know that we do have an Office of Aeronautics. I suspect this group does because you came from CTS and AirTAP. But we like to explain to folks as we get into this kind of non-traditional new aviation community that we do have an Office of Aeronautics and the services that we provide. So just like the federal government has a Department of Transportation with the FAA and FHWA in in their organization, we also have our Minnesota Department of Transportation, and Aeronautics, led by Cassandra Isaacson, is part of that as well. So I am going to talk a little bit about a few different levels of unmanned aircraft. So Yolanda mentioned the small UAS aircraft, which share some similar characteristics and space as AAM, but are not the same. So we'll talk about SUAS a little bit first, and then step into the advanced air mobility technologies. So drones and unmanned aircraft are fundamentally changing aviation as we're used to it. So we've been kind of operating with these fixed wing aircraft, helicopters in an aviation space, a fence line, for the last 100 years. And this is really changing with small unmanned aircraft, and as we branch out into these advanced air mobility aircraft quite a bit. So we'll talk a little bit about how that looks for us. The FAA is a safety organization. MnDOT also has a safety mandate. We and the FAA see safety and security as top priorities for these systems. So that's important as we look at the regulations and how this impacts our communities. The really interesting thing is how quickly the FAA has moved over the past couple of years to accommodate these unmanned aircraft while keeping their priorities at the front. So it was surprising to see, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, there was no license to be an unmanned aircraft pilot. Now there is, and I have some slides about the growth in Minnesota, and you'll see how quickly that has really become part of our lifestyle. And then the really important, I guess, bold starred highlighted thing is communities used to have an airport, off on the side. And now this is really aviation at a local level. Never before has aviation been so accessible to people as it is with small unmanned aircraft, which builds a lot of really interesting pipelines and input, whether it's positive or negative or how people feel. They are experiencing aviation at a totally different level than we did 10 years ago. So that will be really important as we step into this new technology. So as I mentioned, there's the 3 steps to advanced air, the small unmanned aircraft systems that we're currently operating today, electric regional aircraft, which Yolanda touched on with the Caravan and the Beaver that are currently using electric engines, and then stepping into unmanned passenger aircraft, or AAM, advanced air mobility as it's referred to now. So again, I start with SUAS. We did a couple of outreach events with Minnesota cities and public agencies over the past 6 months. And we started talking just from advanced air mobility, and almost 90% of the questions I got was, yeah, but SUAS is still a problem for us. How are we going to handle SUAS? We can't even talk about advanced air mobility when we're still dealing with drones in our communities. So we will cover all 3 steps as we talk through this. So this is Sherry and I. Sherry is the other pilot that helps lead our drone operations at MnDOT. This is us flying a drone looking at an RWIS site for our traffic cameras. So SUAS will be first. So these aircraft, so we are on the same page, are remotely piloted, autonomous aircraft that weigh less than 55 pounds per regulation. There's a picture of a Mavic. That's a super common aircraft made by DJI in China. They have a huge, about 80% of the market. So these are the aircraft that you'll probably see if you're out in the communities. All right, so these drones are aircraft. Aircraft are regulated, so drones are regulated. And it does take a lot of compliance to meet regulatory, to be in line with the regs. We can also do cool things with those, within those regulations, but it takes a bit of work. You can see that snapshot of the Minneapolis area in the bottom right. All of those yellow circles are airfields. They are public, private airports, heliports, different kind of landing spaces for manned aircraft. So you can see it's very complex. There's a lot of rules that we have to follow as drone pilots, as well as manned aircraft pilots, to keep everybody safe. And it's a lot of work, which is why it's taking some time. Although the technology is there, it's taking some time to get the regulations caught up. So my slides are going to advance on their own, I guess. Here we go. All right, so there's 2 types of regulations that we follow as small unmanned aircraft pilots. There is a commercial certificate. It looks the same as my manned aircraft certificate, just has UAS on the side of it. And then you can also operate as a hobbyist. with drones. So depending on what you're doing, the rules are actually very similar. And the impact to the communities is very similar. These aircraft look the same, they operate the same, but the intent of the operation is different. And this is important as we get into some of the aircraft counts and pilot counts in just a minute here. So we do have state regulation for aviation. MnDOT is the aviation regulator for our state. And we regulate unmanned aircraft the same way that we regulate manned aircraft, with one exception. So just like you have to register your car or register your manned aircraft, you have to register your drone as well. So the one caveat is these only apply to commercial drones. Hobby drones are considered not an aviation activity, so they are not registered and insured the same way that commercial unmanned aircraft are. So if you register your drones, obtain insurance for your aircraft, pay use tax, and then if you're offering these services outside of your business, you also have to obtain a commercial operations license. This is interesting because it's given us some insight over the past couple of years of how many commercial aircraft are operating in our state, the types of aircraft that are operating, and then how frequently they're phased out, which has been great to see. So this includes everybody from farmers to state and local government, your sheriff department, everybody that flies drones, anything other than hobby. And then there are also, so stepping down from federal to state, there are also local ordinances. And this, as a manned aircraft pilot, you know, I grew up in Chicago flying, and I'd fly out of Schaumburg Airport, go to DuPage, go out to the landing where my grandpa had his airplane, and you just fly around. You know, there might be noise abatement procedures, but you don't think about what you're flying over because you cross so many lines of cities. With small UAS, we're very local. So we're operating within 1,000 feet, a couple hundred feet. So within a single city at a time, typically, unless you're at the border. But what we're not used to thinking about is all these local ordinances that impact our flight operations. So for example, when I was flying privately, I might be in 8 to 10 cities in a single day and have no idea that these ordinances are at these cities. So for example, in St. Bonnie, if you fly your drone in your backyard, there's an ordinance that's misdemeanor, $5,000 or a year in jail. There's some debate about, depends who you talk to. I'm not a lawyer, but there's some debate about whether some of these ordinances would stand because there's a lot of discussion about who administers the airspace. Typically, it's the FAA, it's a federal area. I'm not going to get into that. There's plenty of other legal sources you can go find. But then other cities like Arlington also has no operations within city limits. U of M requires permits. Mississippi River is a national park, but there's some caveats because it's actually not administered by the national park. So it gets really complex as we're flying our small unmanned aircraft. And this is important because the local ordinances, they're almost impossible to find. Only the advanced experienced pilots know about these unless you've had a police officer show up at your operation. And when we get into the larger aircraft where businesses are trying to operate, this is going to be really complex. As these different locations, this is only a small subset of what we've got in Minnesota. Again, that bottom right link is where you can find the ones that we know about. So we don't know about all of them across the state. But as we get into advanced air mobility, this will impact the business operations of some of these aircraft. So I mentioned that we talk about how these aircraft have come into our state and what it looks like over time for Minnesota. So this is about a 4-year period of the private pilots, so the pilots flying out of your local airport versus unmanned aircraft pilots. So interesting, it's really steady, about a growth of about 1,000 new pilots per year. And this is all FAA data. You can get it at the FAA.gov registry link. So we've had a consistent growth, about 1,000 pilots a year. We now have more unmanned aircraft pilots than we do manned private pilots in our state. Similar thing with UAS registrations. This data is a little bit old. I just haven't had time to update my spreadsheet, but we've been growing at about 2,000 registrations a year. And again, these are the federal registrations with the FAA. This is commercial aircraft only. So this does not count the recreational aircraft. And we'll talk about why that's important in just a minute here. So significant growth. US-wide, This was back from October, that 6.42 times more drones and GA aircraft. We're probably up above 7 times more drones than general aviation aircraft. So the number of these aircraft growing are quite significant. We do suspect that we'll hit cap shortly or kind of stall out a little bit, but these aircraft are growing fast, especially even in our state, in our city, and our states. So the interesting thing is we are about 2 times unmanned to manned, and US wide it's 7 times. There's probably a lot that goes into that, but it's just a note to consider as we go forward. So we did a survey. So one of the important things with aviation, we've seen with airports, heliports, and stepping into unmanned aircraft and future advanced air mobility is understanding what our stakeholders and communities want, what they're experiencing, and then how they want it to go forward. So we did a survey to kind of get baseline temperature of what our communities feel like. This was last November, and got some really interesting information. So we asked people, do you own a drone or do you know somebody who does? We wanted to know how much this technology has penetrated our communities. And 3/4, 75%, 74% of people either have a drone or know somebody that does. And this was across Minnesota, rural and suburban and urban. So really interesting how much the UAS market has penetrated our communities. And then this is an interesting one. I did not expect this, but almost 3/4 of respondents fly their drones, or their friend flies their drones for recreation use. So that means those number of aircraft that we saw are just a fraction of what's actually out there. So the majority of these drones are recreational purpose drones. And then we asked them how they felt about drones. And this is a tricky one for aviation in general, because there's a lot of strong feelings about aircraft and operations that people on the ground don't participate in, but are impacted by. We suspected, based on media reports, that people would not be happy about drones. And we're interested to find that really less than 10% had strong negative feelings about these aircraft. And that's why it's really important to start engaging people early and understanding their feelings about aviation and where they see the positive and the negative, and what their strong feelings are about these different kinds of aircraft. And so we followed that up with, what do you think is beneficial? What are the positive uses of these aircraft? And this is important because as we start to see these technologies mature, there might be certain uses that are more that communities have a better appetite for. So for example, a lot of the early drone delivery uses have been for medical specimens, delivering prescriptions, and that's because they have a really high rate of acceptance among the public. So we're looking at 75 to 80% acceptance for search and rescue, medical uses. There's some interesting discussions about how a medical helicopter sounds quieter than a news helicopter or military helicopter because of the perceived benefit of that use of the aircraft. So as we start to look at how these technologies mature in our communities, this is something interesting to keep in mind as we look at the different use cases. All right, so moving on to what's next. That was a small unmanned aircraft in our state. We're going to look at what it means and what we're looking at for the advanced air mobility. And I've seen this slide a million times with a lot of the presentations that I've been in with NASA and CAMI and other groups, and I actually really like it. So I'm going to share it myself. This is a picture of a street in New York City. So on the left is a whole bunch of horses and buggies bringing people around. And there's one little fella in the red circle driving his car. And that was in 1900. And then 13 years later, you look at the same city, slightly different perspective, but now they're all vehicles. And there's one little fella driving his buggy. And I don't even remember where he is. He's somewhere in the center left. And this is interesting because it was a significant change in how we move people around our cities. We are looking at something similar. We are not going to all be driving our own personal advanced air mobility pods. This is not quite the Jetsons yet, but this same type of introduction of technology will happen. So if we look at small unmanned aircraft in 2015, we were on the picture on the left. And we are now have 75% of people own an aircraft or are familiar with drone aircraft. So we're approaching the picture on the right in just about 5.5 years. So that's really significant. As we look at the growth of advanced air mobility aircraft, we are seeing, and I'll have a slide in just a minute, the number of aircraft coming to the market in the next couple of years. The adoption won't be widespread, but the availability will be there. So the difference is our infrastructure is quite complex and expensive now. So getting ready for this new technology will take quite a bit of work. All right, so this is a picture from NASA that shows the different use cases of advanced air mobility in the future. So everything from micro haul, bringing people short distances, to air metro scheduled services, air taxi. You may have seen the Uber YouTube short videos that shows a woman calling up her Uber car. She hops in the car, goes to a building, goes up to her Uber pod, flies on her pod, gets home, takes an Uber to her house. End-to-end mobility with those scheduled services. Airport shuttles will be important, especially in the short term. Like Yolanka mentioned, the building to building operations are kind of the further application, and going from a feeder airport into MSP, or bringing people from an outstate location into Bemidji or something like that would be important in the near term. Emergency services, as I mentioned, those have a high acceptance rate, so we'll be looking at that in the short term. Some TZD opportunities there, as well as delivering things like blood specimens, lots of other uses there for medical. And then cargo, we have a number of airports that have industrial areas around them and that have needs to ship cargo. So this will be really important for some of our airports in the near future. Also getting all those Amazon packages around. Hopefully COVID is almost done, but we're still going to want our Amazon and other packages. All right, so this is a technology tradition. Important star there. These are not dates that you'll see the aircraft, but it's expected initial aircraft certification of some of the front runners. So drone delivery, there is now a path to get aircraft certified for drone delivery vehicles. Rumor is there's a couple that are nearing certification, probably late this year. So these are the small aircraft like you see in the bottom left with UPS. They are unmanned aircraft. They have usually a 20-to-1 pilot to aircraft with a control center that's piloting the aircraft. They have high quantities of low-cost aircraft, and usually either last mile or first mile. These are not traveling long distances. They have a number of restrictions based on the kind of aircraft that is being operated. But that is kind of the first phase, and it's a really important phase because it again really brings in that new user group. We are now operating scheduled and cargo aircraft outside of the airport fence, and these aircraft can launch either from launch vehicles or a central launch site in a city within the city without ever touching an airport. And so that really brings into the conversation what kind of infrastructure ecosystem is necessary, what kind of ordinances, and how the public feels about these. And then kind of a midpoint that's a transition between our traditional larger aircraft into the urban air mobility or advanced air mobility is these electric regional aircraft that Yolanka mentioned. So certification dates within the next couple of years. These will be manned aircraft. There will be infrastructure required, particularly for charging batteries. From what I've been hearing, and Yolanka might have more information, but battery swaps are not allowed because it's and I don't know the actual terminology, but you need a mechanic to sign off on a battery swap at this point, is what I'm hearing. So they would have to charge these aircraft on site, which will have a significant utility pull for energy. Huge reduction in operations costs. The state of Washington just did a really neat study with these hybrid electric and electric regional aircraft that showed the significant reduction in operations costs with these. And then the third category is urban air mobility. There are a couple of leaders in the market that are looking at certification in the next 5 years or so. These will probably start as manned aircraft, as Yolanka mentioned. They do have some aircraft that are starting with full automation, but they will typically be manned first and trend toward automated. There will be significant infrastructure required for these. Significant not as in new airports, but as in specific landing space outside of our current infrastructure or attached to our current infrastructure. They're typically eVTOL, so electric vertical takeoff and landing. A lot of them are tilt rotor, so they can get that forward efficiency. And the range is around 200 miles. So when we're starting to look at use cases, batteries are really the limiting thing here. If you've flown a drone, you get like 20 minutes, and that's a small drone. These batteries are much bigger, but batteries are still a very limiting factor when we look at these aircraft. This does change regularly. As Yolanda mentioned, there are a couple hundred of these aircraft that are in some stage of development. So this is something that's changing a lot as we look at going forward. So the technology will be ready. These aircraft are flying, as Yolanda mentioned, there's been thousands of hours on some of these airframes. They're there. They just need to get through the regulatory hurdles, certification, which are important, but also not really the limiting factor at this point. It's all of the infrastructure and ecosystem around these things. So for example, airspace and air traffic control. So the traditional air traffic control system and airspace that we have today won't really work for these high quantities of small aircraft. So if we look at the small UAS, we do have to get air traffic authorization when we fly in controlled airspace, but we never talk to an air traffic controller. Almost never. There's a few rare cases, but we are not allowed to talk on aircraft radios under any circumstance. We use an app to access air traffic control. Some of the responses are automated. Some of them do require somebody at a desk to look at them, but we do not use the current air traffic system. Now, granted, we are flying lower than most of these aircraft, though we do fly right up to, in some cases, right over airports. As we look at some of these new aircraft, they're looking at ways to build either corridors through, kind of like helicopter corridors through these airspaces, or find another way, because the load on air traffic controllers would be just unacceptable. There are also going to be a lot of operational changes. So detect and avoid, when you don't have a pilot to see and avoid, you have to have a way to detect and avoid. So a lot of aircraft, depending on where you operate, currently use ADS-B. We just had a major rule change for small unmanned aircraft to implement our own ADS-B-like system called Remote ID or RID. It's not a detect and avoid at this point. It's a situational awareness tool, but there will have to be detect and avoid technologies on our small unmanned aircraft that are doing drone delivery. And also as we grow into the larger aircraft. So there are some of those on our manned aircraft, but they are not a singular system. You wouldn't use them to, you wouldn't have a pilot that couldn't see flying with those systems today. And then also routing, how you change routing with an unmanned aircraft. Some of this will be figured out on a much smaller scale with small unmanned systems that will kind of lay the groundwork as we get into some larger systems. It's a different risk profile and a different technology as you get into the larger systems, but it's still something that's going to get the public aware of what's happening. The ecosystems are also going to be really different from what we have today. MnDOT administers about 80 AWAS systems. The way that those are currently managed today, we could not expand that to what is needed for small unmanned aircraft and then getting into the advanced air mobility aircraft. The picture on the right is a commercial system, the IWAS from IntelliSense, that is something that may come to market in the future. There has to be another solution. Some of these are being deployed for small unmanned aircraft to get weather along the routes. And we as in the larger community is looking at ways to find a better weather solution in the future. Same thing with radar. ADS-B does not work at low levels like it would need to be successful. So whether that's something like North Dakota's Vantis system, they're kind of the leaders on looking at low-level radar systems for these technologies, or something different. There has to be another way to have radar services at low levels. And then the big one is the local involvement and non-traditional partners. Again, this is aviation outside the fence. We need to have a way to talk with local partners and local communities, understand what their inputs are, how they feel about this, and how they want to move forward in a coordinated way. So everything from ordinances to noise to privacy, which has been a huge one with drones, and kind of a question mark as we get into unmanned aircraft that are larger, and then also the investment. So typically, a lot of this has been federal funded, state funded, and some community funds. That is going to change. There will probably be a lot of a lot of private funds, a lot of private businesses investing in some of these multi-use options. Like some of these weather systems might be important for local weather, looking at, we have we've already had tornadoes and tornado warnings here in Minnesota. So looking at how those weather systems can be used for multiple uses will be really important. And so the big thing going forward is how we're building our stakeholder communication and engagement. Again, this, when we looked at getting our survey out, how do we reach the people that we aren't reaching today with small unmanned aircraft systems? And we're trying to do outreach. Hey, there's been a rule change, or we have these ordinances or the state statutes. We don't have a reach out like we do to our airports. We don't, and our pilots, we don't have the same reach to our unmanned aircraft in our communities that are now experiencing these aircraft in a new way. So understanding and building that foundation for having a new conversation around aviation is really important.
Katie, this is Brian. If I may just kind of interrupt, sorry for that, but I'm getting some text messages that some folks are not able to see or hear the presentation. Maybe if you are having trouble, if you could just let us know in the chat box. But I am still picking up Katie just fine, but just let us know through chat if you're not.
Great, thanks, Brian. So again, the technology will be ready. United's purchased, through Mesa, has purchased a whole bunch of Archer aircraft in advance. The Aviation Alice has said that they're going to be certified and available, we'll see, by 2023. There's hundreds of aircraft in development. The Joby on the left there received their military airworthiness in December. They're talking about certification in 2024. NASA is flying some of these aircraft in CONOPS, scheduled for later this month. So the technology is going to be ready. It's the ecosystem that we're looking at. So it's talked about lots of pieces that go into this pie, everything that we currently do in aviation plus more. So we will have, and these are a bunch of different snapshots of different uses in the bottom here, but everything from the infrastructure, we think about so most of these AAM aircraft are battery powered or hydrogen powered, and getting that amount of power to an airfield, or they're calling them vertiports or vertipads, the areas that they're going to land at, these new types of helipads, getting that amount of power to those places, that's a significant change in transportation's use of electricity. And at the same time that we're going to be drawing more electricity for our unmanned aircraft, we're going to be drawing a lot more electricity for our electric cars. So being able to generate that much electricity for both of these new fuel sources for transportation will be significant. Again, the new way to pilot these aircraft. So initially they will be likely piloted by a commercial pilot, but going forward, as these become more automated, what does that mean to our aviation schools? How are they going to train their pilots differently? With these new electric engines and electric systems, how are they going to train the maintainers differently? Are we going to have maintainers in more spaces as these vertiports expand beyond the traditional aviation system? Do we need more maintainers? How are we going to handle security here? Dispatch. And so the list goes on and on of how we're going to get this right on the ground before these aircraft can even fly. This is a slide that was built off of one of CAMI slides. So why do we at MnDOT care? So beyond the fact that we have the Office of Aeronautics, we also are looking at this as a new mode of transportation or continuation of the aviation mode of transportation. So it will, as we've gone to COVID, a lot of companies, MnDOT and state agencies included, have found that more people can work from home and visit the office less. And so what this might do is result in people moving away from the typical commute range. So if you only need to go in the office every 2 weeks, would you be willing to take a pod from Mankato to St. Paul? Would you be willing to, drive that 2 hours once every 2 weeks? Will that change how people are going to move through our system? So there's, as Yolanda mentioned, reducing traffic through the core. The volume of these things might not actually result in that, but it will increase our ability to have urgency travel. So if you do need to get from one place to another and don't want to sit in that traffic, this will be a new option. We'll talk on the next slide about what that means for Minnesota. In our current highway system. So it does add a third dimension. The interesting thing, as like mentioned, that aviation has traditionally been an incredibly safe mode of travel, but we're going to be looking at automotive production levels. So that's going to be an interesting way of changing the dynamic of that, and then bringing into the consideration public trust if there is an incident. So it's going to be a very interesting line to walk of that safety. Again, lots and lots of opportunities for skilled and unskilled jobs. The revenue source is an interesting conversation as well. So the traditional way for both ground vehicles and air vehicles of gathering fuel taxes to support the ecosystem will change because they won't be operating with traditional fuel. A new way to leverage existing infrastructure of our outlying airports and of other spaces. And then again, emergency response. I was talking with some TZD folks about there's a metric of how close a level 1 trauma center is to a highway, and we're not going to build any more highways to get a faster route to those trauma centers. So helicopters has been one option, but now using these unmanned aircraft could be another option. So other ways to meet current emergency objectives in a new way. A lot of this will be state and local driven. Again, this is aviation happening at a very local level. So all the different aspects of our current heliports and helipads, then bringing it to the very local level and possibly increasing the number of those sites within a city. There's still a lot to be figured out. A number of the supporting infrastructure will not be federally managed the way that they are for traditional aviation, like the weather, like connectivity, traffic management, some of these and routing management. Some of these traditionally federally owned systems will be done through data suppliers. And as they work out how that works, it might be some investments from the local level to ensure diversity and equity. And some of that might be commercially funded. So as we get into Minnesota, there are some considerations for how this looks in our state. There are a couple of early leaders in the industry or in the United States, like LA, Orlando, Dallas, are looking at ways to implement these within the next couple of years. And how it works in Minnesota will be different because we're different. Every location is different. So we'll take into our communities in coordination. We'll take into consideration our current transportation systems. How we currently get around. If you look at a city like LA, the traffic is notorious. So there is obviously a need for some urgency planning and ways to get from A to B without having to use the road system. That might not be as much of a driver for Minneapolis. 494 and some of the highways are kind of a bummer at some times, but it's not the epic 4-hour travel. I used to live in California, and oh man, it's a different situation. Also the population density. So we have, this is just a Google Maps image that I pulled, but some major cities surrounding the Minneapolis area, and then also some significant populations in Duluth, up at Thief River, places that need quick movement down to Rochester, Bemidji, a number of cities around the our state. And then unique routes. So if you've ever flown down to Rochester on a CRJ, it's what's like 14 or 17 minutes, you get like 12,000 feet. It's kind of a bummer use of a jet to get down there. What if we had, instead of driving down 52 or flying on that CRJ, another option for small travel back and forth to Mayo Clinic or to other communities that have a similar need for those unique routes. Infrastructure and acceptance will also be really important. Also our weather. So most of the locations that they're testing these aircraft or, being early adopters are locations that don't have 8 months of winter. So it'll be interesting to see how those technologies can accommodate our current weather. I looked at a number of the certifications for the drone delivery, airworthiness requests for the drone delivery vehicles, and none of them were requesting operations in icing conditions. So that leaves out a percentage of days here in Minnesota. So how this rolls out in our state will be a little bit different than others, and another reason to keep in touch with everybody and keep up on this technology. So where do we start? There's a whole lot of information, and I sit through a lot of these meetings. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this opportunity is so huge. How do we look at it? And we have a good start here in Minnesota because we have a really active aviation community. We have the Office of Aeronautics and other stakeholders that have meetings like this, that have outreach events like this. So we have a lot of lessons learned about our airports, our heliports, our small unmanned aircraft systems. We're the only state that's been regulating SUAS since 2015 in the manner that we have. And we've got a lot of great information about those, a lot of great community input, a lot of people that we're already talking to outside the fence line. So lots and lots of lessons learned that we can then use to start bringing this new conversation together. That communication and engagement piece is incredibly important. There is misinformation, there's incomplete information, and then there's information that people need to have or want to have and can't find. So making sure that we have two-way communication through all of our stakeholders is really important. And part of that is starting up our Advanced Air Mobility work group. We're hoping to get that off the ground later this year, and that will start to get people involved and different stakeholders involved in this discussion. The SASP, the State Aviation System Plan, has a portion of AAM with it, and they have a work group that's been talking about them, and then we'll bring that into the larger Advanced Air Mobility work group. Engaging with other states is also really important. We have great partners up in North Dakota. They are a test center for the small UAS, also radar systems, and have a lot of great information. There's also a couple of other states that are leading that are happy to share. We've talked with a number of other groups and happy to share back and forth. So lots of great information from other people who have been there or are traveling on the same path. And then working on a strategic plan. So we have the State Aviation System Plan, and working something with the Air Mobility Plan will be really important. We're starting to look at how that might come together and plan that here in the next year or so. So lots of planning to plan and getting things lined up here in the future. So with that, I will take my slides down and turn it back over to Brian for the Q&A.
Okay. Thank you, Katie and Yolanda. My goodness, that a lot of information to absorb there. No question about it. I just generally kind of wanted to prime some questions with, I guess starting out, just looking at the slides, I thought it was kind of amusing looking at the slides that both Yolanda and Katie had, showing, I guess, what the future could look like with some of the landing areas and some of the urban air mobility pads and so forth set up, and contrasting that with Katie's slide, going back to the days of the horse and buggy and the, first, I guess, integration of automobiles coming into urbanized settings and what decisions they had to make back then, about that. And I kind of see that as being something even yet today that is very relevant, probably much more complex, just due to the number of people that we have and the policies and procedures we have in place today that we didn't have back then. And I'm just kind of curious a little bit about that. I certainly can appreciate, maybe it's more of a rhetorical question, but just looking at forward, just you can really get an appreciation, for what Katie and Yolanda are trying to do here, that there's a lot of, stakeholder engagement. I could only assume that has to transpire here and trying to figure things out. Is this a federal, issue, and is it going to be, maintained by the federal government, or is it going to be something that's going to be in the private sector and basically monitored and regulated by the local and state jurisdictions? Just being somebody, I guess, who got 30 plus years of experience, I guess, in the aviation airport industry, public service airports, we've got a pretty regimented process and procedure, everything from planning all the way through implementation. But what we're talking about here, it boggles my mind, I guess, at least, of what kind of questions come into play. Where do you start? Where do you start with the planning? And I'm just kind of curious about that, Yolanda and Katie. Maybe have each of you just kind of give us a little bit of a background on that stakeholder engagement, everything from the federal level on down to the local level.
Sure. Well, I'll jump in first if that's okay, Katie. It's a very complicated issue, Brian. You're absolutely right. It's one of the reasons that we formed CAMI in the first place and then formed the Urban Air Policy Collaborative to try, because we don't know the answers. We are making this up as we go. And I say we, not CAMI, we as the industry and the communities that are looking at this. It's one of the reasons that we CAMI are working with NASA and FAA on this roles and responsibilities piece, really trying to understand this. And I think what we've seen is, because as I mentioned and as Katie mentioned, this has, the technologies come together, and this is a technology push market. So we've got these opportunities, but we don't have the environment in set yet in which we can use that. But because we have that, and because this has been driven primarily from industry, a lot of the preliminary conversation has been at that federal level. So it's been about, and it's been agency, right? It's been FAA. It's been about, how do we certify these aircraft? How do we manage airspace? Those kind of questions. And so there's been some a fair amount of thinking about how does this work in a more urban environment and at much higher volumes. So NASA is doing a lot of work on this on the airspace management side and the vehicle integration side. But I think one role that we're trying to play with our Urban Air Policy Collaborative is to say, wait a minute, there's a whole state and local side to this as well. And when you look at the diagram in the FAA's original, first V1 CONOPS that came out last year, there's one little box that says public entities, and that represents all the state and local jurisdictions. And it's kind of like, well, whatever they say, that all fits in this one box. And we're trying to build out that box. So what does that look like? I think, as Katie mentioned, there is some legal uncertainty about airspace management. The basic bottom line is that the FAA manages airspace, but there are some exceptions, and there's some unsettled law there, and that's a whole other webinar that I could give, which I won't go to. But generally, there's the accepted understanding that the FAA will manage airspace, at least for these larger aircraft. But there's a whole piece of planning that goes with that, and what might be an optimum route from A to B in the air might not be optimum for what's on the ground below it. So there has to be integration and working together between the aviation planners, between the FAA and the local jurisdiction planner, transportation planners, to figure out where are the optimum locations for these vertiports from a flight perspective, but also from a transportation system perspective. We also have to have integration in real-time operations. And again, this is a completely new perspective for aviation. Aviation is used to managing flights and potential conflicts, et cetera. on a real-time basis. But once you start integrating these flights into a transportation system, there's more than just the flight portion of it. So for instance, if you down the road develop a local commuter pattern where people are taking light rail from an outside suburb coming into a multimodal hub, a light rail station that also has vertiports that can take them on a quick hop into the urban core. That can become a commuting pattern for some people. Maybe they do it twice a week to go to meetings. If you have that light rail line go down, you can't have all these people flying into that multimodal hub without a way to get home. So there has to be some coordination between the flights and the ground travel. The same thing happens the other way. If you have a weather incident and you have all these people coming in via light rail to this hub, but the aircraft aren't flying, how are those people going to get into the urban core? Are they going to take buses? Are they going to take TNCs, Ubers, Lyfts? If so, the ground transportation agency needs to know that that's happening so that they can accommodate. So I think it's a complex system, and we don't yet know how it's going to roll out, but we know we're asking the questions and working with each other to try to come up with solutions. Katie, your thoughts?
Yeah. And it's interesting from the planning perspective as well. Like, so we have some questions of who's responsible for planning out these systems. Is it the MPOs? Is it the Metropolitan Planning Organizations? Is it the TIP? Is it the STIP? And typically the way dollars are allocated, you can't use federal highway funds or federal transportation funds on aviation systems, and you can't do the reverse either. So if we're planning modifying a transit hub with an aviation system, who pays for some of those dollars? Who pays for the infrastructure going into that, the utility changes, digging up the roads for an aviation system? Who pays, each portion of that? What happens when private funds are involved? So like we were asked, there was a NASA discussion about who's actually planning for these things. What dollars are we using? Whose responsibility is it? Is the city now planning aviation activity outside of the aviation system? What dollars are they using? Is it just a special initiative dollars that are not great for strategy long-term? Or are we going to build this into our 20-year SASP? 20-year SASP, and then we're deep into this stuff within the next 20 years. And where do we ask for these dollars? And what's the steps to get there? Do we do electric first and then build it and they will come, or wait until they come and then build it? There's a whole lot of questions that goes into this planning. And that's why it's important just to start talking about it, get people in the room, figure out how these dollars are going to be allocated from the different, very siloed funding streams that we have now, and work across the different agencies.
Yeah, I'll add one more piece to that. I think that the current infrastructure bill in front of Congress has a huge component for electric charging. And this seems, at least to me, as an opportunity to start to try to bridge some of this, especially if what we do is try to promote electric charging at GA airports. And start to see GA airports as more than just siloed aviation, but as a real community asset. I think we do need to start bridging between that kind of divide that's always been there within the transportation world between aviation and ground.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much for that background. I mean, it's kind of one of those things. I mean, it's not that we're possibly planning for something that might happen in the future. It's we better be planning for this stuff because it's coming. It's already here in some senses. And it's one of those things that to get out ahead of it, can certainly appreciate what the two of you are doing. No question about it. So with that, I'm just going to kind of open it up to the general audience for any questions. I don't see any in the chat room, but just thought I'd open it up for anybody that just wants to unmute themselves and jump in with a question.
I got a question. I know there's a couple of us here that are currently in flight school, actually, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more in depth about the integration of something like this into training at different flight schools around the country, if you have any more insight on that.
Here's a tiny bit, and Yolanda, you might know more, but there was a grant, a federal grant, money that went out to support flight schools looking into these new technologies and how they're going to train for them, both with SUAS and with electric aircraft. I went to UND. I know UND got some of the money for that. So they are considering that. It is part of the discussions in a lot of the work groups that I'm in, but I don't have any details. Yolanda, do you have any additional information?
I don't have any details about what's happening at the flight schools. What I can tell you is that it's flight training has been an early use case that was identified certainly for the fixed wing electrics a number of years ago. So the By Aerospace E-Flyer that I showed you, the one coming out of Denver, is a 2-seat training plane. Those 700 orders that they have are primarily from flight schools, and they are working with a company. I think they've already developed a flight training plan using those aircraft for flight schools. And certainly Pipistrel out of Slovenia, their aircraft are certified in the EU. There are Pipistrel aircraft in California that are being used at a flight school. So I think that I think I can say from a use case perspective that is an early adopter use case. And of course, one of the advantages of that is that you're flying within the current window of battery capacity, and you're returning to the same airport that you came from. So you can have local charging facilities. It's easier to set up than if you're trying to develop a route that requires charging at multiple airports. So I think that it is an early use case that with a lot of promise.
Okay, great. Any additional questions out there? Okay, well, hearing none, I trust that people know where to go. Catherine was one of the people that had actually sent me a notice that she was not able to get or hear any of the audio. So I think that's sometimes the best laid plans, but we did have a backup, and I'll just kind of wrap things up here by thank you very much, Yolanda and Katie, for a great presentation. Just really, really a lot of food for thought here. Wonderful background, very knowledgeable, and I assume on the video, people will know where to contact you if they have any additional follow-up questions and so forth. So again, very appreciative of both of your presentations, great information. Catherine did want to make note to everybody that there is a survey that we would like you to fill out. Kind of helps us take a look at our programs and the different sessions that we have. Invite you to go to the website, be able to fill that out, or if you can kind of see the link, if you want to go to the chat, it's actually in there now. If you want to fill it out while it's fresh in your memory, that would be greatly be appreciated. So with that, unless there's any other things that either Katie or Yolanda would like to say, I guess we'll look at wrapping up and adjourning.
Just thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you, everyone, and take a look at the upcoming sessions that will be presented on AirTAP. They'll be running through the middle of May. So thanks for everybody's time, and have a great day.